Committee, thank you for the invitation to appear again before this committee to discuss the infrastructure funding challenges facing our nation's airports, particularly from my perspective, small hub airports like Spokane. We are the primary commercial service airport for the Intermountain Northwest, serving approximately 4 million passengers a year across Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, and the Canadian provinces of Alberta and British Columbia. Small hub airports like Spokane play a very large role in the economic vitality of our surrounding regions. That's why it is so important to invest in airports to maintain these engines of economic growth. We also operate Felts Field, a top-quality general aviation airport with its own contract tower. Unfortunately, Mr. Chairman, the status quo is not working when it comes to funding the infrastructure investments that our airports desperately need. The Terminal Renovation and Expansion, or TREX project, that we are currently undertaking in Spokane is a case in point and brings the cost of doing nothing to life. Doing nothing is simply not an option for Spokane. Where our main terminal building dates back to the 1960s and our facilities are operating beyond capacity in light of recent double-digit passenger traffic growth. We launched the TREX project to address these challenges by adding gate capacity to meet rising demand and expanding our passenger screening and baggage claim facilities. The full scope of TREX is described in my written statement and summarized in the graphic that you all have in front of you this morning. The total cost of TREX is estimated at $190 million, but significant constraints on the three main sources of airport funding mean that we have limited options to fund this project in a fiscally prudent way. Let me start with the passenger facility charge, a fee on each enplaning passenger that was conceived by this committee as a way to fund terminal buildings and other airport projects. The $4.50 cap on PFCs has not been adjusted in nearly 20 years, meaning that its purchasing power in today's dollars is about half of what it once was. The graphic that I've included in front of you shows what this means for airports like Spokane that are trying to fund significant capital improvements like the TREX project within the constraints of a $4.50 PFC. More debt and no way to fund any new improvements beyond this immediate project with PFCs because the PFC would be extended out so far, in our case, well beyond 30 years. As you can see across the top row of the table on the graphic that I've included, the PFC cap forces us to finance investments over a longer period of time, meaning that we ultimately pay almost as much in interest as we do for the project itself, more than $151 million in interest for a $190 million project under the scenario depicted in my graphic. Moving down the graphic, however, you can see how modest increases in the PFC cap would substantially shorten our financing period and bring down our interest costs significantly, meaning that the PFC could be used to fund other projects that will be needed in the intermediate and longer terms to further improve safety, capacity, and efficiency on the behalf of airport users. The bottom right-hand corner of the table shows that with an $850 PFC cap and a combination of pay-go and bond financing, our interest costs would only amount to about $18.7 million over the term of the financing, or roughly a quarter of what they would equal with the current PFC cap, as you can see in the top right-hand corner. As airport operators, we have to ask ourselves, why should we be forced to take on crushing levels of debt that also tie up and close off this locally directed user fee for the future benefit of those that pay to use the airport when a more fiscally prudent option of adjusting the PFC cap upward is so obvious? I focus, Mr. Chairman, on PFCs because the other two potential funding solutions commonly mentioned are even more constrained. The FAA's Airport Improvement Program is largely focused on airside, runways and taxiways, not terminal and other improvements that are more urgently needed. In fact, in reviewing the $186 million in AIP grants that Spokane has received since 1982, I could only find one grant remotely related to terminal improvements, and that was only for about $2 million, and it was out of a set-aside fund for preconditioned air units on jet bridges to reduce aircraft emissions. In addition, tapping AIP entitlement funds for terminal improvement projects that the FAA considers as relatively low priority jeopardizes discretionary AIP funding for other projects, effectively closing off this resource. Finally, our net operating revenues are dedicated to paying for items that do not qualify for either PFC or AIP support. Things like paying to construct parking lots and aircraft hangars, buying police vehicles and shuttle buses, and building administrative space. A crushing debt load would harm the ability of the airport to generate sufficient operating revenues net of debt service to fund these important projects that are not eligible for PFC or AIP participation. Bottom line, Mr. Chairman, is that increasing the PFC is the most viable way to increase funding for improvements to our nation's airports infrastructure. The cost of doing nothing is simply too high, and represented by the unreasonable concessions and contortions that we must make to fit our capital improvement projects into the confines of our current funding system, as well as the many projects that never actually get off the ground. This is not the way that a nation committed to building world-class infrastructure should fund its airports. I strongly urge this committee to come together on a bipartisan basis to properly and equitably fund our nation's airports infrastructure by increasing the PFC. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today and look forward to